when we explore these topics and these different ideas with guests, I mean, we're going to ask them a little bit about the substance of what they're doing. But I hope what we're doing a better job at getting at is, what is it like to have an idea? What is it like to get out there and take a risk? What is it like to take stock in your life and figure out what you really want to be doing? And then what are some strategies from there? So, while, some guests may bring up medium-term rentals as a strategy that works really well for them, well, somebody listening to that 6 years from now may not want to adopt that particular strategy, but hopefully the advice they're giving about what it really just feels like to step back, come up with a plan, and take the risk, that's timeless.
Welcome to the Real Estate Law Podcast. Jason Muth here with straightforward short-term rentals and pride-away stays. We're here with our attorney and real estate broker, Rory Gill. Rory, we have a special episode today.
We've been doing this is our 200th time getting together to do the podcast. And wow, have things have changed from the very beginning. I remember when we first sat down to do this at a table with microphones, and our desire to be absolutely perfect and kind of my fear of speaking meant that we had to do 100 takes every single time we wanted to get any single point across.
Do you remember sitting around a table where the two of us are there with a Zoom recorder, like an actual, before Zoom was a company? Well, I think it probably existed back then, but like it was just an audio podcast we were doing with these microphones, XLR cables, recording into this device, uploading it, producing it ourselves. It was a much different world when we were recording it that way versus where we are today.
Right, and we weren't sure if anybody was going to be listening to it, let alone watching it, and we just kind of plugged along until we found our stride. It took a little bit, a couple fits and starts, but here we are, 200 episodes later.
Yes, this is episode 200. I do want to correct one thing you said earlier. A number of our episodes are quick take episodes, all right, but not that many of them. We've done well over 100-something episodes where we're actually doing original content, where we're interviewing people. We introduced a way to bring back past content back in November as our quick takes, and those certainly count as episodes. And this is episode number 200. Really proud to have recorded all these episodes with you, Rory. I know this is something that was difficult for us to commit to at the beginning. That's what happens a lot with podcasts, where people have this great idea. They hit the ground running, they sketch out their podcast, they have their first episode explaining why they're doing it, they do another couple episodes, and then they just kind of tail off. Why do you think that happens?
I think it's because it's hard. It's hard to think about what we're going to talk about. I mean, we are the Real Estate Law Podcast, but are we really going to have a 200-part seminar on, title laws in Massachusetts and New Hampshire? No, people aren't going to listen to it, and it's not going to inspire our listeners. It's not going to inspire us. Instead, we found ways to really dig down deeper and ask us a lot of more profound questions. Who is in this space? What are people doing? And I think kind of the first thing that comes to my mind is, why are we doing all of this in the first place? So, now that we're 200 original content episodes into the podcast, I'm feeling like it's time to reflect a little bit about, what we've learned, and some themes that we've come across that have really kept us together, and some themes that have spread across, almost all of our guests, whether they were real estate entrepreneurs, whether they were pushing a particular investment fund, or they're just introducing us to a new way of getting involved in the real estate space.
Yeah, so we're going to take this time to indulge ourselves a little bit and talk a bit about what we've learned over the past 200 episodes. And I also want to give a sneak peek at the end of this episode into what it's like to be producing the Real Estate Law Podcast, and things that we've learned about ourselves and our lives, and how that's changed over time, over these past 5 years of doing this, and just the ins and outs of actually producing a podcast of this length. I get a lot of questions from other podcasters asking, how do you do it? What's your system? What's your procedure? I don't want to lead with that in this episode. So if you're interested in that content, fast forward, there'll be a chapter marker or something in YouTube about this if you're watching the video. But I do think it's time to reflect, on all the guests that we've had and some common themes. Rory put together a couple that I thought we'd touch upon in this episode. Then we've heard these things as recurring topics that come up. And when we book guests on the podcast, we try to get a good variety of people of all different backgrounds and all different types. and different areas within the real estate and real estate law worlds. We don't exactly know where every conversation is going to go, which I find extremely interesting that some themes have popped up over and over. So, Rory, what are some things that you've heard on an ongoing basis as one of the hosts of the Real Estate Law podcast?
Well, I mean, I think the top thing I've heard throughout doing the podcast is our guests, insistence on remembering their why they're doing what they're doing in the first place. A lot of our guests are involved in, the real estate space, and there are a lot of unconventional ways to get involved, meaning that a lot of our guests work for themselves. They've taken the risk to explore a new niche or practice area or business idea that's untested. They work unconventional work hours. They have unconventional work arrangements. And all of these things seem exciting and different, but a lot of it goes back to their why. For a lot of people, like it is for us, it's about being able to focus on your children and your family, being present for all of that. For some people, the why is they want to see the world. They want to, they don't want to be tied down to a cubicle. They want to, they just want to take risks and do something exciting with their lives. And the people who seem to be the most focused, the most successful, are really anchored in remembering their why. Why do they get up every morning? Why are they doing this? And it's, for very few cases, I think it's to add dollars to the bank account. Those dollars and the work is a tool to get people to their ultimate reason for getting up in the morning.
Yeah. Very few people that we've spoken with are, working with corporate America these days. Like, if they're working for somebody else, they play a large role within a smaller company. The majority of the people we've spoken with are entrepreneurs, where they've launched something, or they worked for corporate America prior, and then they decided they wanted to go out on their own, whether it was their choice or not their choice. One theme that did come up a lot, Rory, if you recall, some of the older guests, and I could say that as one of the older hosts, is the people that remember the financial crisis of the late 2000s. So 2008, 2009, how real estate really did contribute to that. And that came up frequently with a lot of our guests, where they made a pivot in their lives around that time because they were forced to, whether they had a job separation, or whether their investments went under, or whether their investments became less profitable. They realized that they had to make a change with how they were operating. And that actually does lead into another one of the topics we've talked to. We've spoken to people over and over about how the world is changing. We're even seeing that today. Fast forward to when we're recording this, which is in 2024, we've been in a period of relatively long, prolonged interest rates in relation to what a lot of people are used to or have been used to if you've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. And, we're not prognosticators. Some early indications are that inflation may have peaked, so maybe the Fed's going to start lowering the rates again, which might get reflected in borrowing and might help, the logjam in the real estate market. But, if there's anything that we learned, is that you could never sit still, and you could never do the same thing over and over, because the world could change around you. And if you're not changing with it, then you're going to be left behind.
Yeah. So, I mean, if our first large point was that everyone needs to remember their why, the second large point is the world is constantly changing around us. That means the market, that means our culture, that means a lot of things, and it changes quickly. I remember going back to the beginning of kind of the bigger pockets age, where we saw a couple different investing styles that were all the rage, and there was a lot of content, a lot of good advice for those particular investment strategies. But after a few years, the ground shifts underneath all of that, and it doesn't work. If you think back to the financial crisis shortly thereafter, it was about being able to go into this, all this available low-cost inventory, buying it, fixing it up, and stabilizing it, rinse and repeat. Then when the market had a little bit of an upward trend, that strategy was refined a little bit into what they called the BRRRR, buy, rent, refinance, repeat. With a lot of long-term rentals. Then we saw market kind of fill up and tap out as a lot of those stressed markets started to stabilize. And then we went into the short-term rental boom, which we very much participated in, where people were able to extract the best and highest use out of properties by using them as short-term rentals and getting a higher top-line revenue for each of those properties. But recently we've seen the rate shift, and we've had to be a little bit more creative. Some of those low-hanging fruits that were the subject of all the advice that we received are not panning out. So the world always changes. What is great advice for this year, we're recording this in 2024, might not be good advice for next year. And if you're really good, spot the trends, see the direction we're heading. It's like a receiver in football. You don't want to be, you don't want to throw to where the receiver is. You want to throw to where the receiver is going to be. And that's the second point is, even in the few years we've been doing this, the earth has shifted, and investment strategies and things that were trends when we started are historical at this point.
Look at you pulling out some football references. Usually it's like you skate to where the puck is going. I haven't heard it used on the football side, but I appreciate that. We watch a lot of football in this household. Yeah, we try to produce episodes that have legs. Like we're not a New York Times or Washington Post or NPR daily podcast that people listen to on their drive to work every single day that has current information. We realize that. We try to encourage our guests not to speak too much about anything that's going to date the episode, because we know that people hear these episodes as time goes on. We take a look at the metrics, and after the first couple weeks, those numbers are a fraction of what each episode ultimately receives in terms of exposure and downloads, because people will find those episodes 3, 4 months, 5 months, a year, 2 years into it. We write really great show notes in an attempt to get indexed on Google for a lot of these episodes. So if a host is on and they're looking to build credibility or talk about something, and if people want to search afterward, they might find an old episode of the podcast they recorded with us, and we hope that the content is still relevant. But realizing in this space, it does change, and it can change on a dime. Rory, you're a real estate broker. You've seen some markets over the years where, if you miss the wave, even by just a couple weeks, you might be left holding a property you can't sell, or there might not be buyers for you. Or if you're on the buying side and you don't act as quickly as other people do, then you're certainly not going to get that property that you want. So, we do understand how speed and velocity is important, but we also understand how observing when a trend is changing is critical in this. And, that's why we're hoping that we don't record too many episodes that are super dated with content. We love to talk about topics that, do have legs. And most of this stuff does.
When we explore these topics and these different ideas with guests, we're going to ask them a little bit about the substance of what they're doing. But I hope what we're doing a better job at getting at is, what is it like to have an idea? What is it like to get out there and take a risk? What is it like to take stock in your life and figure out what you really want to be doing? And then what are some strategies from there? So, while, some guests may bring up medium-term rentals as a strategy that works really well for them, well, somebody listening to that 6 years from now may not want to adopt that particular strategy, but hopefully the advice they're giving about what it really just feels like to step back, come up with a plan, and take the risk, that's timeless.
So another topic that we've talked about repeatedly on this, and this is probably self-serving or self-fulfilling, because we invite people on who come from a variety of backgrounds, is that there's always a new niche to explore. Right? It's not like there's just one way that you can make money in the real estate or real estate law worlds. If you're an investor, or you're a private or you're private landholder or property owner, you can make money kind of the traditional ways. People know how to a residential property and rent it to somebody. That's kind of the most fundamentally simple way to try to have income, as a real estate investor. But Rory, we've talked to an awful lot of people that are in various niches and corners of this world. Commercial real estate has come up on a regular basis. We've talked to a lot of people that are raising capital, who are syndicators. We've talked to people in the industrial real estate space. We talked to a lot of short-term rental operators, medium-term rental operators. On the law side, we've talked to people that work with attorneys on branding and public relations and crisis management. I think it's limitless as to the types of topics that we can bring onto this podcast, but the common theme there is that there's always a new niche to explore.
The riches are in the niches. When we bring in these topics, we have a couple ones that are near and dear to our hearts. We're short-term rental operators, so we love exploring that space, in great detail. Even within that space, there are a lot of niches and a lot of crazy ideas that people are working on. But it's eye-opening to talk to people in the various corners of real estate that we just don't know well. I mean, flipping rural land is not something that, I've been tied to, participated in any way. And seeing that that's a strategy that not only works here and there, but is enough for somebody to thrive and build a life on is really captivating. And then even within the service of real estate, because we're talking about many ways you can invest in real estate, but there are many ways that you can service investors. As an attorney, that's what I do. Being an attorney does not make you a real estate investor. You're serving the investors themselves and working on the transactions that they have. But the many different ways to help people, brand, to market, to find personal assistants and virtual assistants to help support them operationally. All of these things are ideas that I hope we're bringing to our listeners and our audience out there of ways to get involved in real estate.
We talked about creative financing on an ongoing basis. We talked about how to reach different generations of people. If you're looking to raise capital from accredited investors, it's speaking to Gen X and boomers. If you want to try to buy, help first-time home buyers or people that are looking to get into the real estate game, it's usually working with Gen Z or millennials and be able to communicate with them in different ways. We've spoken to people that are building affordable housing by using, upgraded mobile homes and mobile parks. We're talking to people that are in the self-storage space. Just the list goes on and on. We talk to people about, how to really super serve your local market. Talk to a lot of women leaders, that are looking to build up these great networks of women in real estate and having their own space to be able to lift each other up. And create their own communities in a space that is, pretty predominantly male. We've talked to people about communication, and how you can communicate, whether you are a real estate agent, whether you need to have a good presence on social media, or whether you're talking to the news and need to, explain why your building caught fire. I think that there's been an awful lot of interesting conversations that we have been fortunate enough to be a part of with these amazing guests that have come on our show and given us their time. I almost feel like we're getting a free hour of consultation, Rory, from all these different people that have been on the podcast.
I mean, the feeling after we had a guest on who's talking about something, particularly something we don't know, and the feeling that you have right after recording the session, saying that, we really need to get out and look at industrial real estate right now. We need to get out and pursue this strategy because it's really captivating and exciting to hear what they're adding to to the real estate community.
So that kind of leads into our fourth area that has been an ongoing revelation to doing this podcast, and that is that conversations and connections are critical to everything that everybody does. Somebody did mention on this podcast that the ultimate cheat code is having a podcast because you get to talk to people, give them a platform, learn from them, and now you have a connection. You've spent an hour, 40 minutes, half hour talking to somebody, plus the time planning the episode and then all the promotion afterward. They're more likely to take your phone call later on, whereas maybe they wouldn't take it if they didn't know who you were. But Rory, what have you picked up from all the people that we've gotten about how they view building connections and building relationships?
It's that the connections and the relationships come first and the deals come afterward. Deals and opportunities in the space are not advertised, they're not posted for the most part. It's about those incidental conversations that you have with people. It's about making yourself known. It's about making yourself known even when you're not entirely confident in what you're doing. Getting out there, talking to people, making those connections. Just think, in our immediate sphere before we think about the, podcast guests and how it works. But, every time you've partnered with somebody, worked with somebody, it's because you actually met them in person and started a conversation and kept that conversation going. And when there was an idea, when there was an opportunity, you're the first person that they thought of, or they were the first person you thought of to partner in that opportunity.
So let me, shift gears a little bit. And I didn't want to lead this episode talking about us and making it about us. But we get a lot of questions about how to run a podcast. And, we know a lot of our friends that we run into, out and about, we know they listen because they mention it. So either they listen during long drives. We've had some friends that are like, oh, I listen to your podcast when I drive to my house and wherever. Or they just kind of see clips that we post on social media, and they see that we're doing this podcast. I know that there's people out there who are listening. We know there's people listening because we hear from a lot of our guests and their agents, their PR companies who want to get booked on the podcast. Plus, we see the metrics of the episodes. So I want to share a little like behind the scenes stuff in this podcast. Because we are 200 episodes in and we have a bit of a track record at this point. I mean, Rory, can you remember when we did the first one? Like when was it? This quiz.
This was in, I believe, 2019.
True. So what we did with this podcast is we recorded 8 episodes audio only in February and April of 2019. We were our own producers. We produced these things and we produced 8 of them. Just so when we could publish them, we published them in 2 groups of 4 to show that we have some content. We're not just putting one episode up online and saying, hey, everybody, we have a podcast, go download it. Like, why would they do that? It's just one episode. But if we had a variety of different topics, and all those first episodes were you and I talking. So it was why the world needs a podcast about real estate law, short-term rentals, Airbnb, and what laws you need to know, condo associations and the law, how to submit a strong real estate offer. That was our first EP in the world of music. That's what we published first, and we thought maybe people would find us. After those 8 episodes, what happened?
Nothing.
And why?
That
I know
life happened.
There you go.
So life happened in 2019. That's when we had our daughter.
Right.
But I don't want to necessarily lean on that as an excuse. We just didn't keep going. We didn't really know what step 2 is going to be.
Yeah, and that gets into the why of why we're doing this in the first place. So we launched this in 2019, and as Rory mentioned, like our daughter was born in May of 2019. So after we released the 4 April episodes that we recorded, we were in daddy world. And, if you're listening to this, when you have your first child, our only child, your world turns upside down. Like your time commitments change. Your ability to have, time to record is very different. And we basically said, all right, let's shelve this. And we shelved it for 2 years. There were 2 years that we recorded no new episodes between February of 19 and February of 21. Let's think about what happened in the world back then, okay? So we recorded the episodes. We're, all excited about it. The first episodes we recorded, we didn't even know about our daughter, because, peek into our lives, we adopted our daughter at birth as a newborn. We were there for the birth. She was born in May of 2019. We learned that we were going to be the parents in March of 2019. So we recorded 4 episodes before then. We recorded 4 episodes afterward. And then we did nothing for 2 years. Not nothing, but we didn't record anything with this podcast. During those years, we're trying to learn how to be daddies. And by the way, the world shut down. Right? So what happened with your business then? We bought an office in Boston. We were going to use it for podcast space, and we were going to have a big grand opening and all that. And then the world shut down, so people weren't going to offices anymore.
Yep. So we purchased an office at the very end of 2019. And we're fixing it up, building it out for basically our grand opening on March of 2020. And that never really panned out. And the office was never really used the way we planned on it being. It was going to be a spot for all the agents and our clients to meet. It was a place for us to put on presentations. We had, podcast recording corner. It was, meant to be kind of a lively, active space. And that, that isn't really what happened.
But that's okay because... But yeah, the world changed around us. I mean, like when the world shut down, we had that space. You were able to go into it. People can go in sparingly. We were still living in Boston at the time. This space was in South Boston, in Southie. And as our lives changed, we realized that we probably wanted to move outside the city with our daughter. And that's exactly what we did. We moved to a great town called Newburyport in 2022. So shortly after we resumed the podcast, we started to put the pieces in place to change our lives. I was still working for another company as a W-2 employee. We were doing short-term rentals on the side. I knew that that was going to end because I wanted it to end. And sure enough, they gave me the opportunity for it to end when they said that it's over. And I said, great, I already have my plan B, and that's what I'm doing now. So I shifted directly into that full time. That's after we moved to Newburyport, but the plan was in place for us to do all that stuff at the same time. And then you weren't going into Boston as much either since we moved up here. So we decided to sell the office, and we sold it at a profit, which is great. So we certainly didn't lose money on that endeavor. We got some money out of it, and we moved on from our lives. All along, we continued this podcast. So we launched this one again in February of 2021. And I said to you, Rory, I said, we're going to relaunch. And guess what? It's going to be a video podcast.
Yep. And that was, I had a ton of apprehension about the audio in the first place, let alone the video. At the time, I wasn't a complete stranger to video marketing. I would do video short form emails with auto clients and everything. I found that is a great way to connect. But in the execution of it, I was very uncomfortable. Part of me wanted it to be perfect. I would record these inane videos to send to clients saying, thank you for reaching out. I'm so excited to working with you. I'm so excited to work with you. And to say, do 40 takes of the same message to get the intonation and the voice and the expression just right, to the point that it was a little bit artificial. And to do this podcast, we had to get over it. There's no way that I personally could ever keep up perfect intonation, have absolutely no ums and ahs for an hour. I just can't do that.
But part of what's great is that you could edit things out in post-production, but also these are meant to be a little rough. We listen to some really slick and polished podcasts that have full teams of people who produce them, with, major celebrities, and they just are on their A game, their media personalities, and, they really rarely flub up. Having worked in the media business for a long time, everybody flubs up. Like all the great talents, if you ever listen to their outtakes, what you hear is not always what makes it to air. But doing a podcast like this allows us to just kind of be ourselves. And what you see legitimately is what you get. I think a lot of people probably know us personally. And I'd like to think that what we present on this podcast is just an extension of us and vice versa. I'd like to think that if people are listening to this podcast and then meet us afterward, that they know it's the same person. It's not one person that's recording the podcast and somebody else that they meet in person. Okay, so, taking you through that world, 2021, we relaunched the podcast, okay? And we launched that in, February 2021, all right? We basically released a new episode every week from that date onward. That's what got us up to about this number 200. There might have been like 1 or 2 weeks in there that we somehow missed an episode, but we committed to it. And I think people appreciate that. I appreciate the commitment that we have to producing this podcast. And when people look at it and they look at the body of work, whether you're looking on our website, realestatepodcast.com, or looking on YouTube or iTunes or Spotify, those kind of the big places where people will see or hear the podcast, when you see the breadth of work and the types of guests that you have, I think it adds a lot of legitimacy to what we've done and what we've created. And part of my goal in doing this was to add credibility specifically to you and to what you do, because that was kind of the reason why we did it, because I had a different job. I didn't know I was going to be an entrepreneur at the time. I just knew I knew the media business. But then that's also since shifted, because when I went through my rebranding back in 2022, when that job ended and I became full-time, short-term rental guy, entrepreneur, real estate investor, I had to rebrand to the point that I think I was just saying this to somebody yesterday. I don't think that the people that know me in my current world knew what I used to do. And I don't think the people that knew what I used to do in that current world see me. A lot of them that have followed what I've been doing, they see me all in doing this. Like they know I'm not going back. They remember working with me and the work that I did and how I held myself and what I knew. but they're not waiting for me to go back to that business. Like I'm just so all in on this. And the podcast is one great way to help the two of us brand ourselves in the world and the way that we want to be seen.
I mean, our whys have shifted throughout this, and that's okay. Our reason for doing this changed over the course of time. I think, the reason why you got involved in real estate in the first place also changed over this time. But, it was a way for marketing for my businesses. It was a way to kind of build up a reputation of competence in those businesses. But then, as the market shifted under my feet for a couple of years, my reason for doing this podcast also changed. Instead of just, kind of a straight up marketing, it was a good opportunity for me to make connections and come up with ideas of the ways that I could evolve my business. Back in 2021, when we rebooted the podcast, we were in a market full of transactions. And that's how, as a real estate attorney and a real estate broker, that's how I made my money. And, refinances were all over the place. Purchases and sales were, it was a thriving business. But once rates went up, the volume collapsed, which meant that I had to look for other ways to grow my business. And what naturally fell into place here were ideas that I could see off of the podcast, new connections that could be made, and ways that, I was listening to ways that other people pivoted their business and learn from that, ways that I could pivot my business so that it's, more resilient in different markets.
Yeah. So we've invited lots of guests on this podcast. We haven't mentioned specific names in this recap, because we love all our guests. I mean, like, some have been fantastic. Some have been, not as good. We certainly won't name the ones that are bad. I do want to highlight a couple of the good ones, as we kind of continue this conversation. But I'm looking at, I do all the booking for this podcast, right? Like, so I'm actually going to give myself credit. And I'm going to take the credit because I deserve the credit. Like, I book everything, all right? I book all the guests. I do all the presents for our social media. It's not perfect, but it's something. Rory, you come on and you lend your expertise, in the real estate world. I am not the attorney. Lots of people somehow think I am because of the name of the podcast, but Rory is the attorney and the real estate broker. I'm just the loudmouth and the investor that keeps the conversation going. But yeah, anything new that we want to try, I'm the one out there looking at it. Like, we're actually recording this on a brand new platform. This is our first episode on a podcast recording platform called Riverside, which is meant specifically for people that are recording things like this, recording courses, webinars, podcasts. Like, it's meant for it. We've been on Zoom up to this point, which is also a great platform on which you can record. And who knows, Rory, once you send this to our producer, we might learn that Zoom is the better platform, but we're certainly trying out this episode on Riverside. We have a producer, so we have people that are producers for this show. We had one producer and then we switched over to a different one. So I used to produce all the audio myself. And one thing I've learned over the years is trying to outsource as much of the things that you can, if it's trainable, if you can teach someone how to do it. And if it is not, your bliss. And if your time can be spent kind of better elsewhere, that comes up all the time with real estate entrepreneurs. It's no disrespect to the people that choose to do the production in their lives, but if they're really good at that, let them do it. Pay them for it, and then move on. So I figured that out relatively early in the process. So we do have a producer for this podcast that produces audio and video, does a fantastic job. And we publish all the episodes. Actually, our producer sets everything all up. And we are starting to build out a bit of a social media team to be able to, promote the episodes. Because we do like to have our guests be the stars of each episode when we invite guests on. Some of those early guests that we had, I remember those episodes very clearly because they were the first times we were interviewing people. But I look back at my list of all these episodes and, I have a clear delineation between my world and my post-W2 world. And, that delineation happened on July 1st, 2022, which is when I found out that my job was no longer. So 1/3 of the episodes that we recorded were prior to then. 2/3 were after. So the majority of what we've done with this podcast has actually been since I was no longer part of the W2 working world, which I kind of find a little fascinating. But I think back at some of the guests that we've had, and, I think at this point we should name some names. We've actually had some pretty noteworthy people on this podcast. The very first one was Natalie Palmer. who has since turned into like a really big influencer in the short-term rental world. She's run her own conference called Level Up Your Listing in Scottsdale the past couple years. I've met her in person at short-term rental conferences, and she is pretty well known in this space now. But I remember reaching out to her on Instagram, being like, "I love your videos. We'd love to have you on the podcast." And almost had to convince her to be on, which I find interesting. Some other people that have been on the podcast, we've had a number of Bigger Pockets personalities on, which is always kind of flattering to us, that people that have written books for BP or are personalities on their main stage have appeared on this podcast. Ziana McIntyre is one of them, who I spent some time with in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, when I was invited out there for a short little think tank. And I had realized that she was the same person I saw speak on stage the year prior. So we got to know each other pretty well. And, we reached out to her, invited her on the podcast, talk about medium-term rentals. And she was fantastic. She lives her best life. She's one of the best people to follow on social media, because you talk about your why. She knows her why, and it's to live the life she wants to live. And she's really good at making money that allows her to do that. But we've also had Avery Carl on, who is another short-term rental expert. And Avery is also an author in the Bigger Pockets world. We had Eric Oliver on, who has spoken on the main stage at BPCon, and he came on as a member of Cost Segregation Authority, and we complimented him to no end because he helped you and I save a lot of money. He didn't know that at the time, but once I realized that was the same person, I'm like, that's the guy I want to do our cost segregations. Then we had him on the podcast. But above all those guys, the one that's probably most known that we had on the podcast was Dave Meyer. And we had him on about a year ago. And Rory, what's your perspective of how that story came together?
So normally we go out there and we reach out to people that we'd love to have on the podcast. We build connections and we work them, and then we invite them to join us and get them to register. That's not how Dave Meyer came to be on the podcast here. It started with lunch. We were out to lunch with some other people, and Jason spotted somebody walking through the restaurant that he recognized, and just turned to me and said, "Wait here just a moment. I'll be right back." And then you saw Dave Meyer in a restaurant in our little city by chance, and then you cornered him, and you wouldn't let him leave until he signed up to do the podcast.
That last part of the story is not quite true. This was the jab right hook. All right. So I ran up to him, reintroduced myself because I'd met him once before, but he wouldn't have remembered that. Asked what the heck he was doing in Newburyport. Turns out he was driving with his soon-to-be wife on the way to their wedding in Maine that weekend. And they randomly veered off the highway and randomly stopped in our town and randomly happened to walk into the same exact place that we were having coffee at the same exact time. It was a very serendipitous meeting. And his now wife, Jane, he tells the story that she was completely amused that we recognized him because, what were the odds that he gets recognized right after they get off a plane from Amsterdam and start driving to their wedding? And that's exactly what happened. But he was an awesome guest, as all of our guests tend to be. But we loved having him on. I kind of love telling that story. When we started booking guests on the podcast, we were thinking, who the heck would want to come on this podcast, right? Like, why would they want to talk to us? So some of the early guests that we had, we were really just kind of taking anybody that was connected to real estate somehow. And, if some of those early episodes seemed a little off topic or even promotional for the person that was coming on, like that was okay. We were just getting our reps in and understanding what it was like to interview somebody for a podcast. We have had people on who we know as well. I know I invited my cousin Kyle on early on, he raises capital and he does a lot of work in real estate financing in New York. He was a great guest, and I was just like, I need guests on this podcast. Let me go to my network. I'm actually surprised how we haven't tapped our network as much for guests.
I think one of the biggest surprises as we went along was just how many people out there want to be on the podcast and tell their story, which, we don't have to pull teeth by any means to get people to come on to the podcast. So you just said in the beginning, we were very happy to have anybody who had a story to tell to come onto the podcast. But now we're at the point where I think we can curate which guests actually come on. But Shift snuck up on me a little bit. There were a couple of people, who and one of the reasons I think we haven't tapped our network as much is just because when we open up the podcast for people to join us, it fills up relatively quickly. And that is something that was a bit of a surprise. But I do think going forward, a couple of things we can do to improve the quality of the podcast are to, take advantage of the situation we've built for ourselves, and that's curate guests that have, good, interesting information to share with our audience, but also tap our own network of, we have some interesting people that we know that we've worked with that may not think that they have a story that's worth telling, to everybody across the country, but they do have good stories to share.
Yeah. I like the episodes where we know the guest personally because I feel like the conversation flows a little bit easier. I don't know how it comes across though. Like, I don't know if people hear it and clearly hear us just like, like shooting the breeze with like things that maybe are inside information or things that we might know about that person. But I don't know. Those conversations seem to go really well. I agree with you in that we have not tapped our personal network like here throughout New England as much as we should. So if you're listening to this and you know us and we haven't asked you to be on the podcast, like reach out to us or we might come knocking on your door. The path of least resistance when we're booking is taking, from the people who want to be on, curating from them, right? Because there's a lot of limiting factors in our lives, right? Like time is the biggest limiting factor. Money is another limiting factor. Attention is certainly another one. When we were working with our first producer, we were paying for a certain number of episodes per month. So I didn't want to exceed that because this podcast, believe it or not, doesn't make money for us. Like it makes money for us in other ways. It builds credibility. We build our business. We meet interesting people and do deals with them. We learn and we tangentially make money that way. That's how a lot of podcasts will make money. They monetize it other ways, whether they're selling a book or a course, they're doing a conference, they're looking for coaching gigs, whatever. That's usually how people use podcasts such as this. Like ad dollars are much more minimal. If you think you're going to launch a podcast and like make the money that like Joe Rogan's making or Tim Ferriss or, Prof G or Kara Swisher or any of these people, you're not going to. Like it's a very, very rare occurrence for that to happen, not to be too discouraging to people. But usually people utilize podcasts like this to build up their credibility and their network and then go find other ways to monetize the audience. So we were thinking, like, hey, why don't we just see who wants to be on? So we started taking a lot of guests and then we started curating the guests. And frankly, if I need to book guests, I just kind of go to who wants to be on and pick from those people instead of do the work of reaching out to people to want to be on the podcast. There have been some differences. I mean, the people that we know, I know Jay Cohen, I invited him on the podcast. Avery Heilbronn, I invited him. Jonathan Burke, I reached out to him on LinkedIn. I'd met him, in passing. And I was like, hey, I like what you post. I think you'd be great on this podcast that we have. My cousin Kyle, who was on the podcast, those types of folks, yes, we will reach out to them and invite them on. Ziana, I did invite on the podcast. Dave Meyer invited on the podcast. But, most of the guests that you hear have reached out to us and we've chosen them. And that could change a little bit. We'll see. We don't charge anybody to be on the podcast, right? There's no exchange of money to be on. Like they don't pay us like for the exposure. We don't really believe in that. I actually have... I did have somebody reach out to me that wanted to have me be on their podcast. Then they wanted me to pay for something. And I was like, first of all, you're insane for asking that question because I think it's disingenuous for you to have invited me and now you want me to pay for something to be on there. So I was like, screw off. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the behind the scenes of the actual booking process. And we tend to record in clumps is kind of how I say it. So like either we are actively recording or we're on a recording hiatus. We're never on a hiatus from releasing episodes, but we tend to record them in groups. So we're not constantly recording every single Tuesday. Like what's worked for us, I think this has worked for you, Rory, is that I say, okay, let's open up the calendar. What's your availability these weeks? We put it all together and then we just basically go out there and invite a set number of people and then they book their times and we release the episodes, pretty religiously every Tuesday, the new episodes at least. What we try not to do is get too far with episodes in the can. And it's happened before where we've recorded too many, where we'll record with somebody and be like, yeah, this isn't going to come out for about 3 months. And I feel terrible when that happens. But I'm like, I just wanted to release one every single Tuesday. And we just kind of go down the list. And we just had that many in the can at that point. So I actually track all this. Like if the lead time between when they record and when it's going to come out passes 60 days, then I cut it off. And I say, okay, we're done recording for now. Let's get all these episodes out. Then let's record again. Because it also helps keep things fresh. I don't know if that's worked for you.
Yeah, I mean, we're not a topical news show that's going to, have a dated episode after a week, but, things do change a little bit. And I feel bad for a few of our guests who had a conference or something that they were promoting, and we had to tell them that the episode is actually going to be released after your conference. Mm-hmm. So we can mention the conference, but the podcast is not going to help promote it.
Can I put you on the spot and ask you, like, what has surprised you from being part of this experience of doing these podcasts? Is there anything that, like, I have an answer if you need to think, but I'll ask you
So,
first.
I mean, I'll start with one that I kind of hinted at there, and that is just how many people out there want to share their stories and get on a podcast and do it. I thought it was going to be very difficult to get good quality guests on here, that we'd have to, it would be another full-time job to beg, plead, and convince people to be on here. And that hasn't been the case at all to get the guests that we've had. The other thing that I'm pleasantly surprised by are how few guests come on and try to just promote a good or service or promote themselves. There are some guests who have been on many podcasts and have done many media appearances before. So in some ways it's easy with them because they know exactly how to articulate their story. They know how to communicate. They know how to engage the audience. But very few people have kind of come on here and try to turn this into a commercial. I mean, this isn't hard-hitting gotcha journalism when we have guests on here, but we also don't want it to be just an hour-long commercial for our guests each time either. So I'm pleasantly surprised how few people have tried to turn this into a commercial for themselves.
Yeah. One thing that surprised me is how few no-shows we've had.
Was it the very first time we sat down to record, we had a no-show, and then I thought that was a bad omen for everything else? If it wasn't the very first one, it was very early on.
It was one of the early episodes. We were going to record with Maris Callahan, who is a fabulous social media content creator out of Chicago, works with great real estate agents. We have used her content for years. We haven't used it as much lately, but we still subscribe because I think that her stuff is really good. So a little plug for Maris. We invited her on the podcast, and then some scheduling thing happened where she just didn't get the invite or whatever it was, and she no-showed. So we're thinking, oh, here we go. Now we're recording with people, and we got our first no-show. And, like, I messaged her, and she's like, oh, I'm totally sorry. Like, I just didn't see it. Like, the calendar invite didn't come in. Can we record this day instead? And then we recorded, and it was a fantastic episode. I think maybe 2% of the people who book no-show, and these are people, not like they've canceled. If you cancel or have to reschedule, that's not a problem. Like, we'd certainly do that. But I'm just surprised as to how many times, like, we sit there ready to record, and somebody is there on the other side, and they actually show up, and maybe it gives us, it's a testament to the systems that we've put in place, because we learn how to automate a lot of these things. So our workflow is we have Calendly, where people can book a time on Calendly. We control behind the scenes what times people could actually book. And we had that integrated at the time with Zoom. So a link would automatically go out when people, and a calendar invite would automatically go out with the link on it and the questions that we ask people to answer before they come on the podcast. Now that we're with Riverside, we put the Riverside link in the Calendly invite, and then Calendly takes it from there. And then there are some things you could set up in Calendly that give reminders to our guests. So my guess is Calendly is responsible for the attendance rate of people coming on this show, Rory.
Well, and we also have a lot of professionals that are coming on, and they have their own systems too to, prevent forgetting about something like that. We've been surprised with a couple of guests who have, taken the recording from their car, or they, were on a satellite connection that wasn't strong enough.
That was Case Knockenhauer. God bless him. Living his best life, traveling the world in his Toyota Tacoma with a big hatchback, running his businesses from it, bringing his family around the country, and recording video podcasts on Starlink. That last part didn't work as well, but he switched over to audio only. But you know what? He was a fun guy.
Yeah, this is not a good use of Starlink, but yeah. So we've had a few of the situations, and honestly, we have maybe we've been the problem more than on the other side. We've had to probably cancel and postpone recordings for our own personal reasons, probably more times than we've had guests cancel on us.
I could think of a sick child, one. I could think of a flooded basement, two. We've certainly had Cecily crawl across the screen when we're recording before, but, in the world of Zoom and remote work that, we've learned to adapt to, that is perfectly acceptable, and you just kind of roll with it. Guests seem to not mind either because, hey, all entrepreneurs are doing the same thing. They're working out of their car, they're working from their kitchen table, they're working from their office, they're intermingling their lives, and, we all have lives outside of what we do. And I think that's one thing that's also, rung true with these podcasts is that amount of flexibility that we have with guests when things do pop up indeed. I want to start to kind of like bring this to a wrap, at this recap episode of what it's been like to reflect on doing this podcast for so many episodes and some of those behind the scenes peaks that we gave people. I do want to just kind of introduce a quick little new conversation topic, which is kind of how we reevaluate the podcast on a regular basis. And I would encourage people to do this with their businesses, with their lives, with their relationships. I set aside a podcast thinking week a couple weeks ago. I put it in my calendar. I said to Rory, I'm like, okay, it's my time to think about the podcast. And like, granted, it wasn't an entire week thinking about the podcast, the direction. It was like, let me block this off so it's the theme that I could, every so often when I have an hour or two free in between all the other fires that happen, I can give some deep thinking. So that theme got us to Riverside, saying, first of all, do we want to continue with this podcast? Once we agreed that we do want to continue, I was like, well, let's try to professionalize a little bit better with, better recording tools. So I got our producer involved with Riverside. We did some test episodes to see how he would like the workflow afterward. And, we decided that we're going to try with this platform. But Rory, why do you think it was important that we kind of took a step back and said, let's think about this for a second before we delve into the next 200 episodes?
Well, I mean, it circles back to the very first point that we talked about in the podcast, and that is knowing your why, and your reason for your why might change over time. And, we want to make sure that doing this, all the work, all the effort that goes into, and the expense that goes into doing this is still fulfilling some sort of, purpose for us. And, I'd encourage people to do that if no matter what business you have. I know I've made the mistake with businesses before of getting stuck on the treadmill of some marketing program, some expense, some service. It's always worth stepping back, every quarter or so and asking what's working, what's not working, and what was great a couple of years ago might not be great today. But just make sure everything you're doing when you get up in the morning, when you spend your money, when you, do your work, ask yourself, is this satisfying some purpose that I have?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to continue evaluating that over, these next 200, 400, however many episodes we get to with this podcast. We're always trying to make it better. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly know the systems that have gotten us to where we are today. We're hoping to continue having great conversations with interesting people that we're going to invite onto the podcast. It's been forever since we did an episode with just the two of us. Like, it's been a long time. So maybe we'll do more of these. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like it's just you and I chit-chatting. I like having that third voice on here.
No, it's good. I think every so often, we should circle back and check in and talk about what we're doing. And, maybe actually share some more of the substantive stuff that I'm working on as well. But people don't want to hear just from us all the time. I can assure you that.
I do think that we're going to try to make a couple structural changes to this podcast. So please, if you do subscribe and you've listened this long, we are guessing that you are a regular listener. So you might start to see some of those changes, as time goes on, be the structure of the podcast, the conversation style probably will be the same, but, the intros might be a little bit different. And, I'm weighing a couple other ideas as to how we can evolve this into, how it's going to continue serving both our needs and the needs of our audience. We hope that as a listener, you've learned a thing or two from us, whether it's in this episode or all the episodes or any individual one that you've heard. It's important to us that we share our truth and we share information that might make you better, whether you want to be a better investor or run your business better, legally understand how you should run your business, understand the real estate investing space, understand mindset and why you're doing what you're doing. We like sharing our stories, and maybe they're stories that you could relate to. Having heard from guests from all across the country and all different walks of life allows us to see that the way we live our lives is not the only way to live our lives. And we see other people living their lives a lot differently from how we live, and that we appreciate seeing that that difference in perspective. Not even difference of opinion, but just difference in how they run their lives. So with that, Rory, I think we have come to the end of episode number 200.
All right. On to another 200 more.
Yeah. On to another 200 more. And thank you for listening. We really appreciate all the support. We haven't dug into any of the numbers on this podcast, but, you could see a lot of them on YouTube. We have hundreds of thousands of views and hundreds of thousands of downloads of these episodes. So we definitely know some people are listening, and, you're one of them. So we appreciate it. We appreciate all the support. You can continue supporting this podcast just by liking these podcasts on YouTube, by commenting on them. We do love reviews. If you want to give us a review on Spotify or on iTunes, those are super helpful. It gives us more exposure with this podcast. And again, as I say in every episode, if you want to be a guest on the podcast, please reach out to us, realestate.podcast.com, fill out the form, and we'll get back to you if we think it's a really good fit. So, Rory, thank you for indulging me in this endeavor. I know that we're dragging you along sometimes, like to put you on camera and, get you behind our microphone. I think you've gotten a lot more comfortable over the years in doing this. You've done episodes on your own, and I think those are some of the better ones because I'm not even talking in those. But you get right to the point like an attorney does. So
thanks for that. And thanks for all the work that you've done to set up the systems to get all the production in order. The podcast wouldn't be what it is without all your work.
I appreciate hearing that. And it wouldn't be anything if people didn't listen. So, again, thank you for listening or watching, and we will see you in the next 200 episodes.